A routine patrol turns into a brutal display of power when a racist police officer targets a homeless gypsy woman, striking her without a second thought. Fueled by prejudice, he sees her as nothing more than another nobody, someone who can be beaten and forgotten. But what he doesn't know is that this woman carries a darkness far older than his badge. And when she decides to take revenge, his life will never be the same. Don't forget to like and comment where you are from. Chapter 1. The Gypsy's last night in the alley. The night was heavy with mist, a dense veil that smothered the narrow alleys of the old district. The air smelled of damp stone and burnt incense, clinging to the crumbling brick walls like a ghost that refused to leave. Somewhere in the distance a siren wailed, a distant cry swallowed by the city's indifference. In one of these forgotten corridors, hidden between overflowing dumpsters and the skeletal remains of buildings long abandoned, Elenia Vasilescu traced intricate symbols into the dirt. Her fingers, frail yet steady, moved with an ancient precision, guided by something far older than the city surrounding her. Her few belongings lay scattered: a tarnished copper bowl, a bundle of dried herbs, a single black candle burning low. A whispering voice drifted from her lips, weaving incantations only the shadows could understand. She had done this ritual countless times, not for grand power or wealth, but for protection, a safeguard against the cruel world that spat upon those like her. The city had given her nothing except reasons to fear. And tonight, that fear would take shape. The storm that came in uniform. The sound of boots striking wet pavement cut through the air like a blade. Heavy, purposeful, cruel. Two police officers stepped into the alley, their silhouettes illuminated by the amber glow of a flickering street lamp. Officer Calloway, broad-shouldered and built like a man who enjoyed using force, led the way. His younger partner, Officer Dorsey, followed, his nervous energy betraying his eagerness to prove himself. Elenia did not look up. She felt them before she saw them, the weight of their gaze pressing against her like an iron shackle. "The hell is this?" Calloway scoffed, stepping closer. His voice carried the sharp edge of a man who found amusement in cruelty. "Some kind of witchcraft, huh?" Dorsey chuckled, nudging a can with his boot. "Figures. These people are always up to something." These people. Elenia exhaled slowly, pressing her palm to the earth, whispering something under her breath. The candle beside her flickered unnaturally, its flame stretching toward her like a dying thing grasping for salvation. Calloway's eyes narrowed. "Oh, so now she's mumbling curses." He stepped forward, kicking over the candle, the small flame extinguishing with a hiss against the damp ground. Elenia finally looked up. Her gaze, dark as the void between stars, met Calloway's. Unshaken, unafraid, and Calloway hated that. The first blow. Without warning, his baton cracked against her ribs. A dry, sickening thud echoed against the alley walls. Elenia gasped, her frail body crumpling forward, fingers digging into the dirt where her symbols had once been. But she did not scream. She did not cry out. She only laughed. A soft, rattling sound, like dry leaves scratching against stone. A whisper of something not entirely human. Dorsey hesitated. Calloway." But Calloway was grinning. "That funny, huh?" Another strike, this time across her back. Elenia's body jerked, her breath leaving her in a ragged exhale, but the laughter remained. A quiet, knowing thing that made the air feel too thick. The candle's smoke curled unnaturally in the air. And then, the shadows in the alley shifted, not from the wind, not from movement, but as if something invisible had stirred. Dorsey took a step back. "Dude, let's just go. She's just some crazy old hag." Calloway wasn't listening. He grabbed Elenia by the collar of her tattered shawl, yanking her upward. Her body sagged weightless, as if she had no bones left to break, and yet her lips were still curled into that smile. Calloway's fingers twitched. The alley felt colder. Elenia leaned in just enough to whisper, "You should not have done that." A shiver crawled up Dorsey's spine. "Calloway, I really think we should." The air in the alley died. The street lamp flickered violently, its light warping. A gust of wind howled through, rattling trash cans and sending loose papers spiraling into the night. And then, the candle reignited. On its own. Calloway froze. Elenia's body slumped from his grip, but she did not fall. She did not collapse. Instead, she stood slowly, unnaturally, as if lifted by unseen strings. The symbols in the dirt beneath her glowed, faint at first, then burning red, as if seared into the earth itself. Dorsey bolted. Calloway didn't move, because behind Elenia, something was standing there. Something not human. The first mark. A deep breath filled the alley, but it was not Elenia's. Calloway's knees buckled. He tried to step back, but his boots wouldn't move. The air around him thickened, pressing against his lungs like unseen hands. Elenia tilted her head, eyes unfocused, her voice no longer hers. "You have been marked." Calloway's throat tightened, his heart hammered. The shadows behind Elenia stretched, pulling toward him, curling around him like 1,000 invisible fingers, tracing the length of his spine. And then, a whisper, right against his ear. "Run." The street lamp shattered. Darkness swallowed the alley. And Calloway ran. Chapter 2. The first oath of blood. The city lights flickered in the distance, oblivious to the curse now set in motion. Officer Calloway ran without direction, his breath ragged, his uniform soaked with sweat and filth from the alley's damp pavement. His heartbeat thundered in his ears, yet no matter how far he sprinted, he could still feel it, something unseen watching him. Somewhere in the depths of his mind, a whisper repeated itself. "You have been marked." He stumbled onto a main road, the asphalt slick with fresh rain. Cars passed, their headlights slicing through the darkness. A few pedestrians glanced his way, confused, wary, but no one stopped. To them, he was just another cop, just another figure of authority who had no reason to be afraid. But Calloway knew better. Something had changed. He crashed against a brick wall, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He clutched at his chest, expecting to find wounds, bruises, anything to explain the crawling sensation beneath his skin. But there was nothing. Nothing except the feeling of something growing inside him. Dorsey's escape and the first mistake. Several blocks away, Officer Dorsey had locked himself inside his patrol car. His fingers trembled as he fumbled with the radio, trying to keep his voice steady. "Dispatch, this is Unit." His throat was too dry. He swallowed, trying again. "Unit 42 requesting immediate..." A whisper, not from the radio, not from outside, from inside the car. Too late. Dorsey's breath hitched. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, and there in the back seat something shifted. Not a person, not a shadow, something in between. He slammed his hand on the door handle, tumbling out onto the wet pavement, the door swinging open behind him. His gun was in his hands before he even registered drawing it, but the back seat was empty. No one there. No signs of movement. Just the silence of the empty street and the steady drumming of rain. Dorsey's pulse hammered. His mouth was dry, his knees weak. Every instinct screamed at him to leave the city, disappear, vanish. But his fingers hesitated over his radio. He should call for backup, should report this. But what would he even say? That he saw something? That he felt something? That some beggar witch they beat in an alley had whispered something in the dark, and now the world itself was shifting around them. His career would be over. His life would be ruined. So instead, he did what cowards do. He got back in the car, locked the doors and drove. The night she woke up different back in the alley, the night had gone still. The candle still burned, its flame now a deep, unnatural blue. The sigils in the dirt still glowed faintly, pulsing as though breathing. And at the center of it all, Elenia Vasilescu stood once more. Her body should have been broken. Her ribs should have been shattered from the force of Calloway's baton. But she stood tall, her frail frame filled with a presence that was not her own. She exhaled, watching as the mist curled unnaturally from her lips. The air itself had changed around her, bending to something she had long since whispered for in her darkest nights. And finally it had answered. She pressed her palm to her side where the bruise was forming, feeling no pain, only the strange heat coursing through her veins. Her breath was steady, her pulse strong, and she felt it, A presence, not beside her, not above her, but inside. Something old, something hungry. Elenia tilted her head back, looking at the sliver of sky visible between the crumbling buildings. The clouds swirled unnaturally, folding over themselves like ink in water. She smiled. Her voice when she spoke was not entirely her own. They will suffer. The candle's flame surged higher, licking at the air with an unnatural hunger. The night had only just begun. The curse takes hold. The first signs began with Calloway. He returned home to his apartment, a small, barely furnished space that smelled of whiskey and old regret. The door slammed behind him, the locks clicking into place, but the feeling remained. That creeping sensation, that presence. His own reflection in the hallway mirror seemed off, just slightly. His face was his own, but his eyes, there was something wrong with his eyes. They looked hollow, like something else was peering through them. He turned away, running a hand over his face, trying to shake off the unease. He was just tired, just paranoid. That damn Gypsy had gotten into his head. He needed a drink. He stumbled to the kitchen, pouring whiskey into a glass with unsteady hands. He downed it in one go, the burn grounding him for just a moment. And then, a noise. Drip. Calloway froze. A single drop of black liquid had fallen into his drink. He stared at it, the dark droplets swirling unnaturally through the amber liquid. Another drip, this time on his hand. He looked up, and the ceiling above him was bleeding. Thick, inky blackness oozed from the cracks, slow and deliberate. Calloway's breath came in ragged gasps. He stumbled backward, his whiskey glass shattering against the floor. His gaze snapped to the walls. The shadows moved, not with the light, not with the wind. They moved on their own. And then, the whisper returned. "You should not have done that." Calloway's legs gave out beneath him. He collapsed onto the floor, staring up as the darkness spread, dripping from the ceiling, bleeding down the walls, curling toward him like it was alive, like it was coming for him. His breath hitched, his vision blurred. The last thing he saw were hands, rising from the darkness, reaching for him, and pulling him under. Chapter 3. The price of spilled blood. The city pulsed under the weight of something unseen. The wind carried a whisper, something that slithered between the alleyways and beneath the flickering streetlights. It wasn't a sound the ears could hear. It was something deeper, something felt, and those who had reason to fear it. They were already running. Dorsey's fear takes root. Officer Dorsey hadn't slept. His patrol car sat parked on an abandoned road just outside the city limits, far from the alley where the nightmare had begun. His fingers gripped the wheel so tightly that his knuckles were white, the leather wrinkling beneath his grip. He told himself he wasn't hiding, that this was just a precaution, but the reflection in the rearview mirror said otherwise. His own eyes looked unfamiliar, bloodshot, sunken, like a man being drained. The radio crackled, pulling him from his thoughts. "This is dispatch. Unit 42, do you copy?" Dorsey hesitated before reaching for the receiver. His voice came out strained. Yeah, copy. You haven't checked in for over an hour, everything okay?" His throat was dry. His mind screamed at him to report it, to tell someone, anyone, that something was wrong. But how the hell was he supposed to explain this? That a homeless woman they had beaten had cursed them? That the air felt wrong? That every time he blinked he saw something else staring back at him in his reflection? "All clear," he lied, rubbing at his tired face. A pause. Then, "Copy that. Stay alert." Dorsey exhaled, leaning back against the headrest. He needed sleep, just a few minutes. He closed his eyes, and in the absolute silence of his car, a voice spoke. "You cannot escape." His eyes snapped open. The patrol car was not empty. In the passenger seat sat a figure cloaked in shadows, not Elenia, something else. Its face, if it had one, was obscured, the features shifting and warping as though struggling to decide what form to take. Its fingers were long and thin, drumming against its knee in an eerily human manner. Dorsey tried to scream, to move, to reach for his gun, but his body was frozen, paralyzed. The thing turned its head toward him, its eyes hollow, yet filled with an unnatural understanding. "Blood was spilled," it whispered. "A debt must be paid." Dorsey's breath came in short, sharp gasps, his pulse hammering in his ears. The thing smiled, and then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The first victim, Officer Calloway, never made it to the station. His apartment door remained locked from the inside, his patrol car still parked outside, its headlights dimming as the engine cooled in the damp night air. No one saw him leave. No one saw what took him. But in the hours before dawn, a single 911 call came through from a neighbor. "Yeah, I think something's wrong next door. I keep hearing weird sounds, like scratching, but inside the walls." A pause. "And I think he's talking to someone, but there's no one else in there." By the time officers arrived, the apartment was eerily still. No signs of a struggle, no forced entry. The only strange thing? The mirror in Calloway's bathroom. The glass was fractured, not shattered but cracked outward from the center, as if something had pressed against it from the other side. And the reflection? It didn't match the room. It didn't match reality. Eilenia's transformation. In the alley, the ritual site remained untouched. The symbols still glowed faintly, the candle now burning a steady, unnatural blue. Eilenia sat at the heart of it all, her legs folded beneath her, her fingers tracing the dirt. Her body was stronger now. She could feel it. The bruises were gone, the pain replaced by something darker, something ancient coiling beneath her skin. She inhaled deeply, her eyes fluttering shut. And in the stillness, she listened. Not to the city, not to the wind, but to the voice inside her, the thing that had awakened. It whispered to her in a language older than the streets that towered above her, and with each word, she understood. Their blood is marked. Their time is short. They will learn what it means to take from those protected by the unseen. Her eyes opened, and this time, they did not belong to a mere woman. They belonged to something else entirely. The walls close in. Officer Dorsey tried to pretend nothing was wrong. He reported back to the station, answered calls, went about his duties as if the world hadn't shifted beneath his feet. But there was no escaping it. Every streetlight flickered when he passed. Every shadow felt too thick, as if it concealed something watching. And every time he blinked, he saw Calloway's bathroom mirror, saw the way the reflection had not matched. He hadn't seen Calloway all day. No one had. And when he tried to call him, the phone would ring once, then cut off. No voicemail, no tone. Just a single whisper before silence. A whisper that wasn't Calloway's voice. Dorsey felt his body go cold. Something was hunting them. The final warning. That night, as Dorsey sat in his car parked in an empty lot, his hands shaking as he struggled to light a cigarette, the passenger door unlocked itself. His breath caught. The handle turned slowly, and before he could react, the door swung open. A blast of cold air filled the car, and Dorsey felt something sit down beside him. He didn't look. Couldn't. His fingers trembled around the cigarette, the flame from his lighter flickering. The silence stretched too long, and then a voice he had been dreading spoke, soft, almost gentle, but filled with something ancient. "You should never have touched her," Dorsey screamed. But no one heard him, and as the night stretched on, the darkness swallowed another. The city remained unaware. But for those who had spilled blood, their time was running out. Chapter 4. When the hunt begins, the city carried on, blind to the storm unfolding beneath its surface. People went about their lives, unaware that the balance had been broken, that something had awakened. For the men who had spilled innocent blood, the night was no longer safe. They could run, they could hide, but the unseen forces that had marked them, they did not forgive. They only collected. A station filled with whispers. The precinct was quieter than usual. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows along the narrow hallways. Officers moved about in uneasy silence, their usual bravado subdued. Something was off, something unspoken. Dorsey could feel it the second he walked in. He scanned the room, his gut tightening when he realized the usual morning roll call was missing one voice. Calloway's. No one mentioned him. No one questioned his absence. It was as if he had never existed. Dorsey swallowed hard and made his way to his desk, avoiding eye contact with anyone. His hands trembled as he fumbled with a stack of reports, trying to act normal, but his eyes kept flicking toward Calloway's empty chair. And when he turned back to his desk, his computer screen had changed. The black monitor had flickered to life without him touching it. And in the dim reflection of the glass, something watched him from behind. A dark figure standing impossibly still. No breath, no sound, just waiting. Dorsey spun around, nothing. The bullpen was the same. Officers hunched over their desks, chatting in low voices. The shadows hadn't moved, but the screen remained on. A single word burned across the display. "You're next." Elenia feels the shift. The air was changing. Elenia could feel it beneath her fingertips as she traced the symbols in the dirt, her body humming with energy that wasn't hers. Her blood had called, and the spirits had answered. She inhaled deeply, closing her eyes. The distant sounds of the city faded away, replaced by the whispers of the ones who had come before. They spoke to her now, their voices curling around her ears like smoke. One is gone. Another is afraid. Soon they will all kneel. She smiled. They were listening. They had seen her suffering, and now they were delivering justice in ways the world could never understand. Elenia opened her eyes and reached into the small satchel at her side, pulling out a handful of crushed herbs and bone dust. She let it fall between her fingers, the wind carrying it toward the dark corners of the alley. She didn't need to hunt them. They would come to her. One by one. The night gets shorter. Dorsey's shift passed in a blur. He moved through his routine, trying to ignore the cold pressing against his skin, the sensation of being watched. But the city felt wrong. Every alley seemed darker. Every radio call came through distorted, voices crackling with something inhuman beneath the static. And when he climbed back into his patrol car that evening, the weight on his chest grew heavier. He was alone now. Calloway was gone, and he was the last one left. His fingers twitched as he reached for his radio. He needed to hear another voice, something to ground him. But before he could speak, the radio cut to silence. A sharp, unnatural pause, and then a voice that wasn't human. "Why do you run, little lamb?" Dorsey's blood ran cold. That wasn't dispatch. That wasn't anyone from this world. He slammed the receiver down, his breath ragged as he threw the car into drive. But the second his tires screeched against the pavement, the street ahead of him shifted. No longer the road he had been patrolling, no longer familiar at all. Instead, a single alley stretched before him. An alley he recognized. An alley he had no reason to be near. The alley where they had beaten the gypsy woman, where they had left her to bleed. His pulse slammed against his ribs as he jammed the gear shift into reverse, trying to back out. But the car didn't move. The wheel locked. The brakes refused to respond. And in the rearview mirror, a shape stepped into view. Not Elenia. Something older. Something that had been waiting for him. Dorsey's breath hitched as the temperature plummeted. His breath came out in sharp, visible clouds. The figure was close now. Too close. Its head tilted, considering him. And then, with no sound at all, it vanished. Dorsey gasped, frantically looking around, trying to find it. A sharp knock hit his window. His heart stopped. Slowly, with terror burning through his veins, he turned his head. Outside his car, standing inches from his window, was Elenia. But it wasn't her anymore. Her eyes, once brown, were black pools, hollow, infinite, stretching beyond reality itself. Her lips curled into something that wasn't a smile, her head tilting as she watched him tremble, and then she lifted her hand and pressed her palm against the glass. Dorsey screamed. The night changes forever. The patrol car was found abandoned hours later, the engine still running. The door still locked from the inside, but no sign of Dorsey. Only his uniform remained, neatly folded in the driver's seat, untouched. No blood. No struggle, just emptiness. as if he had simply ceased to be. And in the alley, where the candles still flickered with an unnatural glow, Ilenia sat cross-legged, her fingers grazing the dirt. Her eyes shined with something inhuman, her body vibrating with a power she could barely contain. The spirits had done what they promised. The debt had been collected, and as she lifted her head toward the night sky, inhaling the scent of a world finally balanced once more, she whispered, "Justice is done." Chapter 5. The city feels the shift. The city had changed. It didn't announce its transformation with headlines or news reports. It was in the air, thick and heavy, pressing down on those who had done wrong. It was in the lights, flickering a fraction longer, casting shadows that didn't match their sources. And it was in the silence, the unnatural quiet that lingered in precinct hallways and patrol car radios, where officers exchanged uneasy glances but refused to speak of the thing they all felt, because to acknowledge it was to invite it in. And after what had happened to Calloway and Dorsey, no one wanted to be next. A night of murmurs. The station wasn't the same. A place once filled with the arrogant chatter of men who wore their badges like shields was now filled with murmurs, exchanged in low, fearful voices. 2 officers gone in less than a week. 2 officers who had laughed as they delivered beatings to the woman in the alley. 2 officers who had thought they were untouchable. And now, one had disappeared from existence. The other was found in his apartment, curled in a corner, whispering to someone who wasn't there. They had taken his gun. They had taken his badge. But they could not take the terror in his eyes, because whatever he had seen, whatever had whispered his name from the darkness, had never left. The last one standing, Miller, didn't believe in ghosts. He didn't believe in curses, spirits, or things that lurked in the dark, waiting for the guilty to fall asleep. And yet, his hands trembled as he lit a cigarette outside the precinct, keeping his back against the cold brick wall, refusing to let anything sneak up behind him. The weight of his gun on his hip should have been comforting, but it wasn't. Because Miller had seen the way Calloway stopped speaking days before he vanished. He had seen the way Dorsey refused to go near reflective surfaces. And now? There were only 3 of them left. He exhaled smoke and forced himself to laugh. What was he doing? Acting like some punk kid afraid of bedtime stories? This was nothing, it had to be nothing, and yet, why did it feel like something was breathing just over his shoulder? Miller's entire body locked up, his breath caught in his throat. He could feel it now, heat against his ear, the subtle, invisible weight of a presence too close. Slowly, his eyes drifted toward the side mirror of the parked patrol car next to him, and he saw it. Not a person, not a shape, just a void, an absence in the reflection where something should have been visible. And then it moved. Miller didn't scream, didn't turn, didn't even breathe. He just took one slow step away from the car, his pulse thudding violently against his ribs. One step, then another, then a voice, soft, whispered, right against his ear. "Do you remember her screams?" Miller spun around, gun raised. Nothing, no one, only the dark, empty street stretching before him. His stomach twisted violently as his hands began to shake, the weight of the gun suddenly feeling useless in his grip. Something was here. Something knew his name. And it wasn't finished with him yet. Ilenia awaits the final piece. In the alley where she had once been left for dead, Ilenia traced patterns in the dirt. Each movement was deliberate. Each whispered incantation another stitch in the fabric of the curse she had woven into existence. The spirits were pleased. 2 had been taken. 1 had been marked, and now only 1 remained. Miller. He had laughed the loudest that night. He had thrown the first punch, and when she had fallen, gasping for air, he had stood over her and smiled. Ilenia closed her eyes, letting the memory flood through her, not as pain, but as power. She had no mercy to give. She had no forgiveness left to offer, only justice, only what was owed. Her fingers pressed into the dirt, her lips parting as she whispered her final command. And across the city, Miller felt the world begin to fold in around him. The final descent begins. Miller barely made it home. His head pounded, his skin burned, his thoughts twisted into spirals he couldn't escape. Something was in his apartment before he even entered it. He knew it, felt it, but there was nowhere else to go. His hands trembled as he turned the key, stepping inside, his gun already raised. Darkness. The light switch refused to work. The air was heavy, thick with something he couldn't see but could feel, pressing against his chest like a weight trying to crush him from the inside out. And then, the whispers. Low, indistinct, from the walls, from the floor, from inside his own mind. She screamed. She bled. She begged. Miller stumbled backward, his breath coming in ragged gasps. No, this wasn't real. This was just his guilt playing tricks on him. Right? Then, a sound from the bedroom. A small, soft rustling, like something dragging itself across the floor. Miller's entire body seized as he lifted the gun, his voice shaking. "Who's there?" Silence. His pulse pounded against his skull. Then, the door creaked open, and she stepped through. Elenia, no longer just a woman, no longer just a victim. Her eyes were black voids, her form shifting between light and shadow, her presence warping the air around her. She smiled, not out of kindness, not out of mercy, but out of certainty, because this had been promised, this had been earned. She lifted her hand, fingers curling as the shadows around her rushed forward, and Miller screamed. The city moves on. Miller's neighbors heard nothing. The night passed as it always had, uninterrupted, and when morning came, his apartment was found empty. No body, no sign of struggle, just his uniform, neatly folded on his couch, just like Dorsey's. And on the bedroom wall, carved deep into the plaster with something inhuman, a single phrase remained. Justice is done. Chapter 6. The Price of the Pact. Miller was gone. Not dead, not missing, erased. No one in the precinct spoke his name. No one even remembered his face. It was as if the world had reached into the past, pulled him free, and let the timeline collapse around the hole he left behind. The last of the three men who had laughed while they beat Elenia in the alley had been claimed. The cycle was complete, but the city wasn't free yet, because when you summon darkness, it never leaves without a price. And Elenia had never belonged to herself alone. The wind carries a warning. Far from the precinct, beyond the alley where it had all begun, an old woman sat at the edge of a rooftop, her wrinkled hands threading beads together with quiet precision. She had felt it, the shift, the settling, the balance restored, but she had also felt something else, something waiting, something unsatisfied. She pressed her lips together, her eyes closing for a long, slow moment. Then she whispered a name. Elenia. And the wind stopped blowing. A night with no end. Elenia stood in her alley, surrounded by remnants of the life she once lived, the scattered candles, the folded scraps of fabric and twigs woven into charms of protection and prophecy, the space she had called home. But the spirits had not let her rest. She could still feel them circling her mind like wolves waiting to see if their hunt had truly ended. The revenge had been exacted, the blood debt had been paid, and yet the whispering hadn't stopped. It curled against her ears at night, clawing at the edges of her thoughts. Low voices, ancient words, reminding her, "You are ours." Elenia inhaled sharply, wrapping her arms around herself as a shiver crawled up her spine. She had been so consumed with making them suffer. She hadn't thought about what would happen next, and now she was beginning to realize the spirits were not done with her. Not yet. A city without a memory. The news reports barely covered it. A few passing mentions of an officer taking an unexpected leave of absence. A single line about an ongoing investigation with no details released to the public. No missing persons reports. No press conferences. Because as far as the world was concerned, Calloway, Dorsey and Miller had never existed, and those who had known them best didn't seem to notice the gaps in their memories. One by one, the people they worked with, drank with, threatened and protected forgot them. Even the corrupt precinct that had shielded them for years seemed to lose its grasp on reality. It was as if their names had been scrubbed from time itself, and deep in her alley, beneath the shadow of the city that had left her to die, Elenia realized what she had done. The truth of her bargain. She hadn't just called upon justice, she had called upon something greater, something that did not work within the limits of human morality, something that did not stop at revenge. Because the spirits had not simply punished the men who had harmed her, they had claimed them, torn them from reality, swallowed them whole, and now they were hungry again. Elenia's breath came in sharp gasps as she stumbled backward, her pulse hammering against her ribs. She had asked for balance, had demanded justice, but the spirits had given her something else entirely, a force without limits, a power that did not end. And now it had its hooks in her, a choice she couldn't undo. She fell to her knees, pressing her hands against the cold, wet pavement. Her body ached, her skin burned. The marks on her arms, the ones she had carved into herself as part of the ritual, had begun to shift. Not heal, not fade, shift. The symbols twisted, their edges curling like ink bleeding into water. And in the silence of her alley, a voice whispered directly into her ear, "You are ours now." Elenia let out a sharp, ragged breath, her fingers digging into the ground. No, this wasn't what she had wanted. This wasn't what she had asked for. She had only wanted to take back what had been stolen from her. She had only wanted to make them pay. But the spirits had never truly cared about her suffering, only about the debt she owed in return. And now, as the whispers pressed against her skull like the weight of an ocean, she finally understood. There was no going back. She had taken from the spirits, and now they were taking from her. A storm brewing in the distance. The old woman on the rooftop sighed, her fingers still working the beads together. She had seen it before, had warned countless souls not to make deals with forces that gave nothing freely. Some had listened, most had not. And Elenia, she had been given power beyond her understanding, power that had granted her vengeance, wiped out the men who had wronged her, twisted the very fabric of the world to erase them. But now that power was settling into her bones. It was claiming her. And soon she would have to make a choice to fight it or to surrender to what she had become. The city feels the shift once more. In the streets, a strange calm had settled. People walked their usual paths, laughter filled the air, but something was missing, a presence, a feeling, as if the city itself had taken a breath it would never exhale again. Somewhere far from the crowds, a candle flickered out, and the darkness that followed did not move like a shadow should. Chapter 7. The pact demands more. Elenia had been fighting sleep for 3 days. She knew that if she closed her eyes, she wouldn't wake up the same. The whispers had gotten louder, stronger. Now they weren't just murmurs in the back of her mind. They were commands. Come to us. Let go. It is time. Her body was betraying her. She could feel the shift happening deep in her bones, in her veins, in the very essence of what made her human, and she was running out of ways to fight it. A city unknowingly changes. Beyond her alley, the city continued as if nothing had happened. People filled the streets, bars overflowed, traffic roared. But something was off. Something was wrong. They couldn't see it, couldn't name it, but they felt it. The air was heavier. The night was darker. And in the places where Calloway, Dorsey, and Miller had once walked, there were gaps, spaces that felt too empty, memories that didn't connect the way they should. It was as if the city itself had lost pieces of its own past, and it was only a matter of time before people started noticing. A face she didn't recognize. Elenia sat by the broken mirror in her alley, staring at her own reflection. But it wasn't hers anymore. Her skin was paler than it should have been. Her eyes, once deep and full of anger, now looked hollow, stretched too wide, too knowing. She leaned closer, and then she saw it. A shadow, not behind her, inside her. It pulsed beneath her skin, something dark and shifting, something that was no longer separate from her. Her breath hitched. She pressed her fingers against her arms, feeling the twisted scars where she had carved the symbols. And they moved. The edges rippled, as if they were breathing, as if the pact had not just been made but was still growing, still spreading. Her hands trembled. She clenched them into fists. No. Her voice came out sharp, hoarse from days of no sleep. "This isn't what I asked for." The whispers laughed. "It is what you were given." The spirits were not done with her. She tried to fight it, tried to push it back, tried to remind herself of who she was before all this started. But the moment she thought of her past, the moment she tried to grasp onto the person she used to be, something else answered, something ancient, something endless. "You do not belong to your past anymore." Her breath hitched. The alley around her blurred like a dream trying to come apart. The walls, the pavement, the distant sounds of the city, they no longer felt real, but the darkness inside her, that felt more real than anything had ever felt. And it was waiting. A line crossed the first time she had called upon the spirits. They had listened, the second time they had answered. But this was them taking their due. Elenia had demanded justice. She had taken power. But she had never understood that power was never given freely. It always comes with a cost. And now, they wanted her to pay. Her hands curled against the pavement. Her breath was unsteady. She could feel the whispers pressing against her skull, clawing at the last shreds of her resistance. If she let go, if she gave in, what would she become? Something more? Something less? Or something that could never be human again? A final warning. A gust of wind tore through the alley. The candles she had lit flickered wildly, the flames twisting into unnatural shapes. And then, from the shadows, a voice. Not a whisper this time, not a spirit. Something else, something older. "You are at the threshold, child." Elenia turned her head sharply, and there, standing at the edge of the alley, was the old woman from the rooftop, the one who had whispered her name when the winds had gone still, the one who had felt the shift before anyone else had. She stepped forward, her eyes sharp, piercing. "You've called upon something that does not let go." Elenia's lips parted, but no words came, because the old woman wasn't just looking at her. She was looking through her, as if she could see what Elenia was turning into, as if she already knew what came next. And she did, because this had happened before, many times before. The last choice she would ever make. The old woman exhaled, stepping closer. "You cannot outrun this." Her voice was quiet, calm. "But you can choose what you become." Elenia's pulse pounded. The whispers screamed, furious at the intrusion. The darkness coiled, wrapping itself tighter around her body, around her mind. She could feel it waiting for her answer. She had only two choices left: to embrace what she was becoming, or to fight it until she broke apart. The old woman watched her, waiting to see which path she would take. And deep inside, beneath the storm of whispers, beneath the shifting marks on her skin, Elenia already knew. She knew what she had to do. The only question was she ready? Chapter 8. The Final Sacrifice. Elenia closed her eyes. For 3 days, she had fought it. For 3 days, she had tried to hold on to the person she had once been. But there was no turning back now. The pact was not a choice anymore. It was a reality, and it was time for her to face it. A city on the edge of forgetting. Beyond the alley, the city moved forward. The precinct was in chaos. Reports were being rewritten. Witnesses who should have remembered Calloway, Dorsey, and Miller didn't. It was as if they had never existed, as if the world itself had erased them. Some people felt it, even if they couldn't explain it. A missing presence, a gap in conversations, a name on a document that no one could recall. The city had lost 3 men, and no one would ever know why. A choice with no return. Elenia finally spoke. "What happens if I let go?" The old woman's face did not change. "You will not be who you were." Elenia exhaled, and for the first time in days, she wasn't afraid of that answer, because who she had been, that woman had already died in the alley that night. The only thing left was who she would become. The old woman stepped closer. "You are not the first. You will not be the last." Her voice was steady. You have been chosen. And now you must decide. She lifted a hand, gesturing toward the shifting darkness that wrapped around Elenia's very being. Will you embrace it? The spirits whispered. Say yes. Say yes. Elenia inhaled deeply. Her hands trembled. Her skin burned. The air thickened, pressing against her ribs. She lifted her head and smiled, and with a voice that was no longer entirely hers, she whispered, Yes. The city would never be the same. The moment the word left her lips, everything changed. The alley shifted. The symbols on her arms glowed, not with fire, but with something deeper, older and endless. The wind rose, carrying the voices of something unseen, something ancient. And Elenia felt herself break apart, only to be rebuilt. Not as a victim, not as a woman who had been beaten and left to die, but as something else, something stronger, something the city would never forget. The end of a beginning. When the wind died down, Elenia stood alone. The old woman was gone. The whispers had quieted. The marks on her skin had settled, no longer shifting but permanent. She looked down at her hands. They no longer trembled. She stepped forward, feeling the weight of her new existence settle around her shoulders like a cloak. She was no longer homeless. She was no longer forgotten. She was no longer a woman waiting for justice. She was the justice, and for those who had ever raised their hands against the helpless, they would soon learn her name. Because she wasn't just Elenia anymore, she was something else. And the city, it was hers now. What would you do? Some doors once opened can never be closed. Some choices change more than just one life. But tell me, if you were in her place, if you had suffered what she suffered, if you had been given the power to rewrite the rules, would you take it? Would you embrace it? Or would you fight against the inevitable? Drop a comment below. Let's see who would dare. And if you made it to the end, you know what to do. Hit that like button, because stories like this, they make us question everything we think we know. And if you don't want to miss the next one, subscribe now. Because some stories, they are just the beginning. The content is fictitious and does not reflect reality or encourage negative behavior.